few years ago, I stood before the nation and said we needed to be moral defibrillators. We needed to shock the heart of this nation.
They tell me that when the heart is in danger, somebody has to call an emergency code. And somebody with a good heart will bring a defibrillator to work on a bad heart. Because it's possible to shock a bad heart and revive the pulse. In this season, when some want to harden and stop the heart of our democracy, we are being called, like our foremothers and fathers, to be the moral defibrillators of our time.
But when I look at now how in the middle of a pandemic, we still don't have the conscience to do what ought to be done when it comes to COVID relief and health care for all. This is the answer to these 14 points. Raising the wage, updating the poverty measure, housing for all, federal jobs program for all, protect voting and civil rights, guarantee high quality public education, immigrant reform, immigrant justice, immigrant rights, fair taxes, using the executive orders. When we look at all these things, I'm convinced that we need a heart transplant. So I went to a friend of mine, Dr. Jackson, who's a heart specialist, who does transplants. And I said, tell me, how do you get to the decision to transplant a heart? And he said, well, first of all, Barbara, we got to have a meeting. Before we ever transplant the heart, he said, we have to have a meeting. Yes. I said, you got to have a meeting? He said, yes. He said, we have to bring the best of every area, because the question is, how do you transplant the heart without killing the body?
All right. My Lord. All right.
There's got to be a meeting. It's not an easy decision.
Yes, sir.
Because you don't want to take the heart out and kill the body.
That's it.
He said, so every heart transplant takes everybody.
Yes, sir.
Takes the whole team.
That's it.
It takes a meeting. No one person can do it alone.
That's it.
That's right.
No one group can do it alone.
That's right.
No one surgeon can do it alone.
That's right.
And when I left his office, I began to think that the same is true if you're going to change the heart of a nation.
That's it.
There has to be a meeting. And then the Holy Ghost got a hold of me and said, Barbara, you didn't have to go to the doctor. You could have went to God. Because everywhere in the Bible there was fundamental change. It began with a meeting. In the first book of the Bible, God doesn't say let me, he says let us.
That's right.
There's a meeting that came together that created humanity as we know it. When they got ready to deal with Pharaoh, they had a meeting down at the Red Sea. They all came together and the sea opened up and Pharaoh drowned. When Goliath was running around saying what he was going to do, David had a meeting with 5 rocks. He got 1 for Goliath and 4 for the rest of his cousins. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown in the fiery furnace, they had a meeting. Down in the valley of dry bones in Ezekiel, the Bible said they had a meeting. And the bones came together and the Spirit blew on them. Jesus had a meeting one day with 5,000 and a few loaves of bread. When Jesus died on the cross, there was a meeting, because the Bible said the prophets that had been dead long ago, when he died, they got up. On Pentecost, there was a meeting. The wind began to blow and tongues of fire came and the word came that your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. But then I started reading the history. In 1852, after the Dred Scott decision, there was a meeting. The abolitionists came together and they said, maybe this decision is just one link of the chain of events necessary for the whole downfall of the system of slavery. Therefore, what they have done has only emboldened and intensified our agitation. There was a meeting when Sojourner Truth and Lucretia Mott came together and they began to build the women's suffrage movement. and they joined at Seneca Fall. There was a meeting when the social gospel movement came together, and they began to declare in the face of gross greed and industrialism that we could not turn away from the children. And they asked the question, what would Jesus do? In the 1920s, there was a meeting called the bonus marches, and folk came together to fight for fair wages, and that led to the New Deal, when black and white and Jewish civil rights lawyers had a meeting in the 1950s, and they decided to take down Jim Crow and to take down separate but equal. In Montgomery, they had a meeting. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, they had a meeting. Then in Selma, they had a meeting. At the Greensboro, at the lunch counter, they had a meeting. In Birmingham, they had a meeting. Started with 40 people, but by the time it was over, thousands had been arrested, and Bull Connor was brought down. Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. When Cesar Chavez was alive, they had a meeting in California, and the workers marched and they fasted. Right now at Oak Flats, the Apache Nation is having a meeting, and all of these meetings changed the heart of the nation at that particular point. I just come by to declare that it's time on June 18th for us to have a meeting, for us to have a moral meeting, for us to have a meeting in the streets. Children got to be saved. It's time to have a meeting. Sick folk got to be healed. It's time to have a meeting. Low-wage workers got to be paid. It's time to have a meeting. Housing must be provided for all. It's time to have a meeting. The atmosphere must be saved. It's time to have a meeting. Indigenous people must be treated right. It's time to have a meeting. Voting rights must be expanded and protected. It's time to have a meeting. We're spending too much money trying to blow up the world rather than save the world. It's time to have a meeting. Too much religion is being used to push hate rather than love. It's time to have a meeting. We've got to change the heart of this nation. It's time to have a meeting. This nation needs a heart transplant. It's time to have a meeting. Are you all ready for the meeting? Are you ready for the meeting? Are you ready for the meeting? God said, if you will have a meeting, I'll show up. I'll bless you. I'll give you power. I'll strengthen you. I'll make you strong. I'll give you favor. I'll make you able to turn this country around. But first, you must have a meeting.
Yes, sir.